B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, July 28th, 2020. Over on Capitol Hill, the Democrats set up a barbecue in the House Judiciary Committee, hoping to grill Attorney General Bill Barr. But he is a really slippery guy, and he is capable of great efforts at deflection, dissembling, and just once in a while he disarms you with a yes or no answer that takes the wind out of the sails of a Democratic question. So the opening statement from Chairman Jerry Nadler attempted to shame a man who has none, saying that he has diverted the efforts of the Justice Department to, these are my words, a protection racket for the president. And, of course, Barr is this kind of Pillsbury doughboy who allows a lot of stuff just to roll off. He's very selective about what he does respond to. He often acts as if, gosh, I didn't really know about that. I don't listen or I don't read the president's tweets. And so there was a whole range of questioning. Democrat from Seattle, Pramila Jayapal, confronted Barr over the federal response to protests, accusing the Trump administration of cracking down on Black Lives Matter demonstrations, while turning a blind eye to anti-lockdown protests with armed vigilantes that occurred in Michigan. Jayapal mentioned the conference call Trump held with governors, where he said that the police have to dominate the streets, dominate the demonstrators, where Trump pledged to activate his attorney general as part of the federal response. And she pointedly noted that when Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, a Democrat, faced armed extremists who came armed to the state capitol, including somebody with a doll that had a noose around its neck. Jayapal, when white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns, there is no need for the president to activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to these critical issues, you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers and pepper bombs, because they're considered terrorists by the president. So Barr feigned that he didn't know about threats being made against Whitmer. Barr continued to dispute that tear gas was used on protesters June 1st at Lafayette Square before the president's Bible photo op at the church there. So there were a lot of questions that were put. I'll just bring you some of the ones that I think were more important. He said he was unaware of the Justice Department's Bureau of Prisons' decision to send Michael Cohen back to prison for refusing to agree not to talk to the media or write a book. Former presidential candidate Congressman Eric Swalwell of California quizzed Barr about his role in that, and Barr said, he didn't know about it at the time. He distanced himself from the decision process. Quote, his home confinement was not being supervised by the Bureau of Prisons. It was being supervised by the probation office. Well, that's one of those answers that Barr gives that ducks the central issue. Did he know about this? Did he give the instruction that Cohen be brushed back and jailed if he didn't cooperate with the gag order? Congressman Cedric Richmond of Louisiana asked Barr about the upcoming election, pressing the Attorney General on whether he believes the president has the power to move Election Day. I've never been asked the question before. I've never looked into it as Attorney General, Barr responded. Then, when asked if the election will be rigged, Barr said, I have no reason to think it will be. But he went on to say there's a high risk that mail-in voting will lead to widespread voter fraud, echoing an unfounded claim by Trump. And we'll be exploring that when we talk about our in-depth interview being released today with Greg Palast, who is very concerned about how many mail-in ballots will actually be counted this November. And when asked if Trump will leave office if he loses the election, Barr didn't answer about Trump. He said, well, if the results are clear, I will leave office. And he added that he's not familiar with Trump's comments on that issue. And this is rich, because Barr defends, and up to a point of, partisanship, I defend his efforts to investigate the origins of the 2016 Russiagate investigations at the FBI and the Justice Department. But when he was asked whether he believes Russia interfered in the 2016 election and whether it's attempting to do so again this year, he replied in the affirmative on both counts. So he disarms people by saying, oh yeah, Russia interfered in 2016, and sees no contradiction between running the investigation that has shown that there was no significant interference by Russia in 2016. Related to this year, he said, I think we have to assume that they are trying to interfere. Also related to the June 1st events outside the White House, he basically was fuzzy about the timing of certain events. He said that he learned in the afternoon that day that Trump might go across Lafayette Square to St. John's Church, but he didn't say what time. Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee asked him when he first learned. Sometime in the afternoon, says Barr, but no specific time was offered. And this is important because we know that Barr was on the scene outside the White House at about 6 p.m., urging the National Guard and his goon squad of unmarked shock troops to clear the area. And we have the allegation from the major in the D.C. National Guard that excessive force was used and the protesters were not causing any problems that required that level of force. In an exchange with Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, Barr said he doesn't think systemic racism is generally a problem in American police departments. Really, Bill? Pressed by Jackson Lee, he said, I don't agree that there's systemic racism in the police departments generally in this country. He defended the deployment of additional federal agents to Portland. Jerry Nadler accused Barr of ratcheting up confrontations because Trump thinks images of law enforcement clashing with protesters will scare more Americans into voting for Trump. Quoth Nadler, the president wants footage for his campaign ads, and you appear to be serving it up to him as ordered. You are projecting fear and violence nationwide in pursuit of obvious political objectives. Shame on you, Mr. Barr. Barr responded, we are on the defense. We're not looking for trouble. And if the state and city would provide the law enforcement services that other jurisdictions do, we would have no need to have additional marshals in the courthouse. So he's very good at providing cover for Trump's indefensible actions. And Barr does it in a very, casual kind of way. Well, we're just on defense here. But he also describes the protesters across the nation, and in particular in Portland and Seattle. He said violent rioters, and anarchists have hijacked legitimate protests to wreak senseless havoc and destruction on innocent victims. Then he played the race card. He said the black community's concerns over unequal treatment were legitimate. But, channeling Trump, He said, quote, "The threat to black lives posed by crime on the streets is massively greater than any threat posed by police misconduct. The leading cause of death for young black males is homicide. Every year, approximately 7,500 black Americans are victims of homicide, and the vast majority of them, about 90%, are killed by other blacks, mainly by gunfire. Each of these lives matter." And that's a fairly deadly statement. It's pretty effective coming from the right. There are a lot of people on the right and people who consider themselves in the center or center-right who will nod their heads when they hear that. And it's a legitimate comment, but it is also a disingenuous way of addressing the agenda of the police reform advocates in this country. The Democrats are putting up a fuss, and I'm glad they are, about elements of the Republican draft of the next coronavirus bailout package. Bernie Sanders put up a tweet and a Facebook post. It reads, "The GOP COVID-19 bill includes $2 billion for F-35s, those are fighter jets, $1.75 billion for an FBI building, $1 billion for surveillance planes, $375 million for armored vehicles, $360 million for missile defense, $283 million for Apache helicopters, $0 for millions facing eviction." And the Pentagon money that you just heard me tick off is actually to backfill the money that Donald Trump stole from the Pentagon budget and diverted to pay for the wall on the Mexican border. And the Democrats, to their credit, have tried to refuse to replace the money that Trump stole. But the Republicans are greasing the way, and Richard Shelby of Alabama, who chairs the Senate Appropriations Committee, well, he got an item in there to replace $261 million for the Navy's expeditionary fast transport ship being built in Alabama. They are restoring all but $1 million, $260 million. But in other programs, for example, a cut of $180 million to the Navy's P-8 Poseidon aircraft is being replaced by $1 billion. And likewise, $365 million that was stolen by Trump from the Air Force C-130 aircraft program is being replaced by double the amount, $720 million. So it's a feeding frenzy. The Republicans see this as a must-pass bill, and they insist on keeping it under $1 trillion, even as they lard it up with all this unrelated spending. And, of course, they want to prevent extension of the $600 a week unemployment benefit from the federal government. They want to cut it to $200, and eventually, even though the states cannot manage the calculations, they want it to be 70% of your paycheck from February or March. They are really determined to keep poor people poor. And the idea that a minimum wage worker would prefer unemployment to working just shows how oblivious they are to the risks that service workers and other people who are at the bottom of the caste system here in the United States have to live with. So Mitch McConnell was asked about that money for the new FBI building. And critics say that Trump has inserted this because he's afraid that if they tear down the old J. Edgar Hoover building and move to the suburbs, that somebody will build a hotel there that'll compete with the one that he has, that he rents from the federal government. And when Senator Shelby was asked about the FBI building, good question, he said, that was an administration proposal. Yeah, right. And another item that is not included in the draft from the Republicans is a dime for election systems and support of the shift to mail-in balloting for this election. And to her credit, Senator Amy Klobuchar has been driving this effort. And this is one of the issues that we went into some detail today in my fresh, in-depth interview with the irrepressible Greg Palast. His new book is How Trump Stole 2020. And he says he hopes that that is merely a warning and doesn't become a fact. But as we discussed mail-in voting and why Trump is so seriously opposed to it, here's what Palast had to say.
So he's absolutely correct, our Agent Orange, our president, when he says if we make it easy for people to vote by mail, no Republican will get elected. Well, yeah, by the way, he's correct. He's looking at the demographics. There ain't enough white guys to reelect Donald Trump. So they got to get rid of the non-white, non-guys. And that's what they're very good at. And yes, so number one, mail-in voting, if we do it, make it easy, make it correct, make it fair. In other words, if we have Oregon, the Oregon system rolls across the country, hey, it's going to be you're going to have a huge turnout. Votes will be counted, and you're going to have a very progressive Congress and probably Stacey Abrams in the White House if everyone gets to vote. Now, but here's the reality. It's not Oregon is not America. And so what we have is a massive blockade on getting you the vote. So what I want to tell you, so is Greg Palast saying don't vote by mail? Not at all. For the number one reason, my friend, I don't want you to die. You don't want to vote and die. It was horrible to see African Americans. And by the way, you notice that in Atlanta, in Lexington, Kentucky, in Milwaukee, the places with the long lines, they were all in African American neighborhoods. You look at those lines. I'm telling you, I have the film. My people are out there. But they were out there for a reason. Not because African Americans like standing in the humid rain for 4 hours in Atlanta. They were standing in the rain for 4 hours. And take a chance of dying from a virus. No, they didn't get their ballots like Jerry Thomas, like Stacey Abrams, who had to go. So, the other thing she could have done is just stand in line for 4 hours to get a new envelope. And they might not give it to her. So they want to take your vote away. And the first way that you lose your ballot, and I'm going to say, I don't know, if I say it 5 times, it ain't enough, Peter. Check your registration. Go online to your Secretary of State or to vote.org. I prefer you go to the Secretary of State or your County Board of Elections for a simple reason, is that you can re-register right there if you're missing. Every state allows re-registration online, except for South Dakota where they don't have registration. They don't bother. No one needs it. So check your registration. If you're unregistered, like Mrs. Jordan, like all the people I saw in Atlanta who were shocked to find out that they couldn't vote, don't wait. Don't be shocked. Please check your registration. By the way, Greg Palast, I checked my registration, and it said no such voter here in California.
That's election integrity advocate, author of the new book, How Trump Stole 2020, Greg Palast. The full interview is available for my subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher. It runs a little bit over an hour, and we cover a lot of ground related to Republican election and voter suppression tactics and the risks of voting by mail. Also related to voting issues, there are 2 judges that Trump promoted to the 11th Circuit Appeals Court who should have recused themselves because when they were on the state courts in Florida, they dealt with the issues of restoring voting rights to felons. This is a big issue. There's 750,000 or so who are affected. And after voters chose to restore their voting rights with no conditions, the legislature redefined the status of these former convicts and said they couldn't vote until they paid all of their outstanding fines and fees. Now, as a side note, I want to commend LeBron James and a group of African Americans who have put a fund together to help pay off those fines and fees for former felons in Florida so that they may vote. But two judges, Barbara Lagoa and Robert Luck, who now sit on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, should have recused themselves because they were involved in a related legal fight as state Supreme Court justices in Florida. But they say they disagree because that was a whole different court. And so they are, I think, breaking the rules. Recusal is a very difficult issue to enforce. It's an honor system. And these judges, Lagoa and Luck, apparently have no honor. And we're going to see how they vote on this matter and if that bias shows up in the final result. And let's credit the former Solicitor General of Alabama. His name is Andrew Brasher. He sits on the same appeals court, and he dealt with the issues when he was Solicitor General in Bama, and he has properly recused himself. Now we take a look at some of the issues related to the ongoing protest in Portland, Oregon, 61 consecutive days. And Monday night again brought waves of tear gas from federal goons who labeled the gathering unlawful. Now, there's kind of a pattern that develops where peaceful protesters are there until, 10 p.m., sometimes midnight. And then the crowd thins out. And it was late at night last night when officials from the federal building told people not to tamper with the fence. And they've put up several versions of this fence to try to defend their space and to keep the protesters out. And almost every night, the protesters find a way to breach that fence. So the announcement, the threat, was met by defiance. At least one person sat atop the fence after apparently getting a boost from the new concrete barricades that had been erected in front of it. So there was a series of warnings, and then there were a couple of incidents where the federal officers popped out of the Hatfield Federal Building, blasted out some tear gas, and then retreated back into the building. At 11:30 p.m., several federal officers emerged. They extinguished a small fire. Just for fun, they set off tear gas canisters. Protesters responded with leaf blowers to direct the gas away from the crowd. Officers retreated in the building within minutes. So that's actually a positive development, that they didn't go out and escalate. They didn't patrol beyond the footprint of the federal building. And get this, the city of Portland is fining the federal government $500 every 15 minutes because that fence that I just described is unpermitted. The tab is now $192,000, and the clock continues to run. The Intercept reports that there is an Air Force Special Operations surveillance plane that has been circling the area over Portland. Now, they do publish a map showing the circles that the plane has been flying in, and only part of the radius includes downtown Portland. So we're told that, well, maybe they're testing it in the unique atmospheric conditions in Oregon. But it's pretty obvious that they are using military assets domestically to surveil what are largely First Amendment protests. The plane is a DO-328 Cougar, and it was spotted via the open-source flight tracking website ADS-B Exchange. The flight data confirms tight, circular flights consistent with surveillance operations in and around Portland. Now, I really am fascinated by people who sit at airports and watch planes land and take off and note the tail numbers. Plane spotters, they're called. Well, some plane spotters noticed that this same aircraft was in Colorado earlier this month, looping over Denver and Boulder, and it showed up in Portland around July 19th. It is based at Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio. Also in Portland, the Wall of Moms have stepped in where the Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum of Oregon failed. And they have filed a new lawsuit, this time perhaps a better venue. They filed it in U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. And the Wall of Moms, joined by Don't Shoot Portland, have filed a suit against Acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf and other officials. They say they have been tear-gassed night after night, left vomiting and unable to eat or sleep because of the toxic poison blasted at them, claiming the tactics are unlawful, said the presence of the agents in Portland violates a foundational principle of American democracy because the agents are essentially performing local police duties reserved for state and local authorities. And a group of members of Congress signed a letter. This administration's egregious use of federal force on cities over the objections of local authorities should never happen. Also, we're learning that the Portland activists are taking their show on the road to the suburbs near Beaverton, where Nike has its world headquarters. And they are noting that Nike makes huge profits selling running shoes and athletic gear, mostly or largely to African Americans. But the diversity in the Nike ranks of employees is sketchy. Black athletes, I'm reading here from the Oregon Live website. Black athletes and black culture have helped make it a $40 billion a year operation at Nike, and yet protesters and a handful of insiders claim the corporate culture is not fair to people of color. And it's troubling to report that there is dissension among the ranks of these protesters. And one of the people who has captured many of these events on a nightly basis, a videographer named Mason Lake, has been attacked twice after he says he's been falsely accused of being a snitch. So he took in a non-lethal projectile back on May 31st that caused him to lose feeling in his arm. But early last Friday, as he took video of a protest, somebody yelled "snitch" and punched him in the head 8 to 10 times. He returned the next evening, and after midnight near the Riot Rib Station, which is shutting down, by the way, he was attacked by several men in black hoodies. He said one of them grabbed him behind the head in a chokehold. He was taken down to the ground and beaten. And interviewed at the hospital, he said, "My memory gets shaky. When I came to, there was a medic in my face saying I need an ambulance." And there's also been quoted criticism by African Americans who are part of the protest, feeling that white people, including some of those who are prone to violence, have hijacked their peaceful demonstration. Also, while I was looking up stories in Oregon media outlets, I got this update. You may remember a few years ago in 2016, there was the right-wing occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. I did a lot of coverage of that, and I was not happy with the way the FBI and the state police set up a roadblock that led to the shooting death of one of the occupiers, a guy named Robert Lavoie Finicum. And while I did not support their protest or their methods, I did cover these events, and it was accused at the time that the shots that were fired when Finicum jumped out of his car at the roadblock came from an FBI agent, and he was tried and acquitted by a jury. Apparently he did fire, but his aim wasn't that good. And they claim that the FBI agent, Joe Astorita, his 2 bullets didn't hit Finicum. So a federal magistrate has allowed the widow of Lavoie Finicum to carry on with a lawsuit, a wrongful death case, against the Oregon State Police, but not the FBI. Now to Seattle, where just as I was ready to come into the studio to talk to you today, the news broke. I got an alert from the Seattle Times. A team of federal security agents recently deployed to the Seattle area has withdrawn. This is reported by State Governor Jay Inslee's office. They came in last week, but after objections by officials, including Inslee, the mayor of Seattle, and the executive of King County, Dow Constantine, the forces have departed the Seattle area. Well, this is big news. This is a victory for the protests. Because Trump could claim that there was some violence, some vandalism associated with protests last Saturday in Seattle. But according to John Hill, a Department of Homeland Security Assistant Secretary, I have confirmed with Customs and CPB, Customs CP Court. You know what I mean. It's one of the immigration groups, that their personnel demobilized and left Seattle. Well, I hope that is a sign of future restraint on the part of the Trump administration. Black Lives Matter has filed a lawsuit against Seattle and King County, asking a federal judge to hold the Seattle Police Department in contempt of an injunction prohibiting the indiscriminate use of tear gas, pepper spray, or other crowd control weapons. And they allege that officers ambushed peaceful protesters and trampled journalists and medics trying to help the injured. Quoting from the suit, the city of Seattle has willfully and brazenly violated the preliminary injunction. The motion was accompanied by 24 sworn declarations describing in what they call horrific detail the injuries inflicted by police officers on protesters, legal observers, and journalists. The motion asks for additional safeguards to be put in place to prevent police from using blast balls, tear gas, projectile weapons, batons, or other less than lethal weapons indiscriminately, and asks the court to order police particularly to leave journalists, medics, and legal observers alone. And it asks for reimbursement of its costs of bringing this suit. Catherine Forrest, one of the participants in the suit, described herself as a mom from Tacoma who works in special ed. She came to Seattle last Saturday to join the Wall of Moms. She said she was targeted with blast balls and pepper sprayed full in the face. I'm still in shock from this experience, she told the Times. It seemed like the police wanted to attack us. We pose no threat to anyone. We are moms standing up for racial justice and exercising our constitutional rights. That's all. And as we reported yesterday, a district court judge, Richard Jones, in June ordered police to stop using violence on peaceful protesters, but his injunction was partly overturned by a federal court last Friday. We've also previously covered the effort by Seattle police to force media outlets to cough up what are called outtakes. That is material that they captured but did not broadcast. And I believe they have a proprietary and First Amendment right to withhold that from law enforcement. But a King County Superior Judge, Nelson Lee, on July 23rd, in a ruling that was somewhat narrow, said that the media outlets had to respond to the subpoena and deliver footage that meets the criteria to the police department. He put some limits on it, saying they couldn't use this to identify suspects in other matters. It's an arson and gun theft case. But to their credit, members of the Seattle City Council, starting with Teresa Mosqueda, quoting her, "It is incredibly important that members of the press have the protection to say they are not actors of the government. We're going to put at risk the lives of journalists if we continue to go down this avenue." And one of her colleagues, Andrew Lewis, said he joined his fellow council members broadly and strongly condemning the police subpoena. Quote, "The independence of the press in the United States is sacrosanct. Trust between the press and the citizenry is critical to ensuring the First Amendment rights of everyone being upheld. It may be part of a blur to you, but back in the very early days of the Minneapolis protests after George Floyd was killed by police, one of the people was a guy who we saw who carried an umbrella. Often it was open and covering his head. He had a unique set of gas mask with twin filters on it. He was wearing a helmet. He was white. He was also carrying a small ball-peen hammer. And he was seen systematically breaking the windows at an auto parts store. And at the time, a woman tweeted, "Hey, that's my ex-husband." And she named him as a member of either the Minneapolis or the St. Paul Police Department. Well, now we're told, and Ross Story broke this, that police have identified, but not named, a 32-year-old white supremacist associate of the biker gang's Aryan Cowboys. They're not releasing his name yet because he hasn't been charged. But if you remember, he was pretty distinct. And the video footage captured him pretty well. And quoting Ross' story, Umbrella Man had been rumored to be a St. Paul police officer, but the department released video evidence, they say, shows that that individual had not been in Minneapolis at the time of the vandalism at the AutoZone store. In a similar incident just this past Sunday in Richmond, Virginia, riots that began in downtown Richmond were instigated by white supremacists under the guise of Black Lives Matter. Protesters tore down police tape, pushed forward toward Richmond Police Headquarters, where they set a city dump truck on fire. 6 people were arrested, and we have no more details. This is a pretty sketchy report coming from a local television station, but it confirms what a lot of people have suspected, that the violent components, the looting components, have come from people unrelated to the police reform components. Now to Austin, Texas, where BuzzFeed gives us the details on the police shooting of an unarmed man, and they knew he was unarmed, 42-year-old Michael Ramos, who was killed on April 24th of this year. A new video has emerged that shows police responding to a 911 call about a man and woman using drugs in a vehicle outside an apartment complex. A transcript and edited audio of the call was released as part of the video. Officers are seen driving up to Ramos's parked vehicle, immediately yelling at him to show his hands with their firearms drawn. The driver door slowly opens. Ramos appears to raise his hands next to his head. A cop is heard yelling, "Michael Ramos, you're going to listen to everything we say. Keep your hands up." Ramos initially complies. An officer then tells Ramos to walk toward him. Ramos yells, "Man, what the fuck, man?" Cop, "Michael Ramos, you're going to get impacted if you don't listen." Ramos, "Man, you all scared the fuck out of me, dog." He then tells them, "Don't shoot," and waves his hands at the officers. One of the cops continues to say Ramos's name, telling him to relax. As Ramos asks, "What's going on, bro? Man, what the fuck did I fucking do, man? The fuck you tripping on, dog?" "Impact him," a cop is heard yelling. "I don't got no fucking gun, dog. What the fuck?" Officers tell Ramos they're going to impact him and that he should walk toward them. He then says no and yells for them to put their guns down. Seconds later, a cop is heard ordering impact him and a beanbag round is fired. As officers yell at him, Ramos gets back into the car and shuts the door. The cops yell, "Do not leave," as Ramos drives the car out of the parking spot, and then an officer fires 3 gunshots at the vehicle, according to a description of the video. The officer who fired that shot, Christopher Taylor, or at least he fired a rifle at Ramos as he drove away, is also implicated in the fatal shooting of Maurice Da Silva, and that occurred in last July 2019. So they knew he was unarmed. And yes, he did defy them by driving away. There's no description that he tried to use his vehicle as a weapon. And once again, they shot to kill. Instead of shooting out the tires or otherwise disabling the car. And this description doesn't tell us if his girlfriend was still in the car. So protests have been going on in Austin, partly in relation to the killing of Ramos. And last Saturday, a man was killed after gunshots were fired. And this gets a little complicated because one of the protesters had a rifle. When a man tried to drive through the crowd with his car, and when the man with the rifle tried to tell him not to do it, or we don't know the exact exchange, the man in the car shot and killed Garrett Foster, who was there with his Foster's a white guy. His fiancée, Whitney Mitchell, is black. She is described as a quadruple amputee. And Foster has been her caregiver for something like 10 years. So no one else was injured in the incident. The driver of the car, who has not been named and apparently not been charged, has been released by the police. In other news, the Trump campaign is facing a lawsuit alleging financial and election rules shenanigans, I guess is the best way to put it, because we don't know at this point how intentional they are and if they are openly defying the law. But the allegation is that the Trump campaign and affiliated committees have not properly reported nearly $170 million in campaign spending that was done through firms that paid subcontractors on behalf of the campaign. And it looks like Brad Parscale, who just got demoted by Trump, has set up a kind of maze of entities. And the campaign is claiming they did this to avoid having to pay commissions to people who place the media. But commissions are the central source of revenue for any kind of political consultant. And it's possible, I've worked on campaigns where in lieu of commission they just paid us a flat fee. That is possible. But we also learn that Parscale has Kimberly Guilfoyle, who is Don Trump Jr.'s girlfriend, and Trump's daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, on his payroll. Of course, the problem is this was an action filed with the Federal Elections Commission, which can't do nothing about it. They can't even muster a quorum for a meeting of the commission. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis, with my gratitude. As of today, worldwide, 16.5 million cases confirmed of coronavirus. Total deaths, 655,000. Total recoveries, she notes, 9.6 million. In the U.S., 4.3 million confirmed cases, 148,000 deaths. Total recoveries, 1.3 million, and total testing, 52 million to date. A federal report from July 26 found that outbreaks in 21 states should now be categorized as red zone outbreaks, having more than 100 new cases per 100,000 people in the past week. The White House task force sent the report to state officials, urged those in red zone states to impose more restrictions. But on a visit to North Carolina yesterday, Trump called for more states to reopen. A lot of the governors should be opening up the states that they're not opening, and we'll see what happens with them. The only state that is considered a green zone is the Green Mountain State. Vermont has less than 10 cases a week per 100,000. The World Health Organization has warned that the pandemic continues to accelerate, with the number of cases worldwide doubling in the past 6 weeks. Fears are growing that more European countries will reintroduce restrictions as Germany, France, and Belgium introduce curfews, social distancing, and quarantine measures. In Texas, Nursing home deaths have climbed 64% just in the past 2 weeks. The recent spike of cases among younger people was that there were concerns that it would trigger a spike in cases among the older, and that appears to be playing out. In Texas and Florida, overall cases doubled while infections in nursing homes jumped by 50% in the last 14 days. The new data shows the precautions taken to protect nursing homes and assisted living facilities have been insufficient to insulate residents from the virus. The American Federation of Teachers, the second largest union in the United States of educators, announced on Tuesday it would support its 1.7 million members if they choose to strike in districts and states that move to reopen classrooms without adequate health and safety measures. The union will allow local chapters to decide whether to strike, but says strikes should be a last resort. The greatest predictor of coronavirus deaths appears to be income, according to David Dayen at the American Prospect. And by the way, Dayen has a new book out, and it's on my reading list, so you can expect him to pop up as an interview guest in the near future here. Dayen writes, by working with demographic and COVID-19 statistics in New York, a small group of researchers and I have found that income, even more than age, race, or ethnicity, might be the most significant driver of COVID-19 deaths. We make this claim cautiously because in the U.S., public health data rarely includes income or occupation. To determine the impact of class on COVID-19 death rates, we have had to use indirect methods of statistical evaluation, but we find a strong correlation. They found that lower-income neighborhoods had an increase of more than 10% over the average death rate. People of color are disproportionately represented in the group, but the common denominator isn't only skin color, it is also income and class. And Dayen writes, these data also confirm what we already knew was true. We are not all in this together. The richer you are, the easier it is to protect yourself. And if you have enough money, you don't have to work in a meatpacking factory or a warehouse or an assembly line. If you're rich enough, you can buy isolation instead of being forced into the fray. Here in California, the hardest-hit areas with rising rates of positive testing are in the Central Valley, the breadbasket, the San Joaquin Valley. For example, in Fresno County, the range of positive testing is 11%. In Tulare and Stanislaus counties, it's 18%, against the statewide average of about 7.5%. So Governor Newsom has directed an extra $52 million into that area to deal with the rising caseload. There is a controversy today that is accentuated by the reaction of Twitter and YouTube. And they have issued, various reprimands to President Trump, to Don Jr., and to others in the entourage. And what they've done is they have posted materials related to a Texas doctor whose name is Stella Emanuel. And I also heard Rush Limbaugh promoting the same topic today. And the tweets have been taken down and the tweeters have been reprimanded because they posted a video of Dr. Emanuel who came to Washington with a bunch of other people who wore their white doctor's coats, and they are declaring that hydroxychloroquine is a surefire cure for coronavirus. Dr. Emanuel claims to have successfully treated 350 people and counting. She says you don't need masks, there's a cure. You don't need people to be locked down. So her group is called America's Frontline Doctors. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have been scrubbing their sites of the video, but apparently millions of people have already seen it. And for background on Dr. Emanuel, well, she runs a practice at a location that is also the site of the Firepower Ministries Christian Resource Center, which she also runs. And we have negative reporting on her. The Daily Beast saying that Emanuelle has often claimed that gynecological problems like cysts and endometriosis are in fact caused by people having sex in their dreams with demons and witches. Well, that sounds pretty ludicrous. And I don't know anything about Dr. Emanuelle, but I have to say that I do not support silencing her or the claims by the social media outlets that what she is promoting is, well, here's a headline from the New York Times, misinformation about hydroxychloroquine. The Guardian headline reads, Twitter limits Donald Trump Jr.'s account for posting COVID-19 misinformation. BuzzFeed says that he posted a viral coronavirus misinformation video. Now, I believe that people have the right to offer their point of view about hydroxychloroquine, and that the people who receive that information can decide for themselves whether it is valid. And so I deplore the censorship in this case, especially when Trump himself repeatedly issues tweets that violate the standards of Twitter and other outlets, that are full of hate, that incite violence. And so this standard, where they become the arbiters of what is misinformation about COVID-19, leaves me deeply uncomfortable. As many of you know, I am planning to retire at the end of this year after the resolution of the November election, and I am relying in part on my retirement money that's in the stock market. It took a big hit back in March, and it is back to almost where it was at the end of February. And this is largely because the Federal Reserve has propped up Wall Street, the banks, and the money markets. So the Fed has announced it will extend its emergency lending programs through the end of 2020. And what happens after that? Because the fundamentals, profits, the GDP, employment levels, consumer behavior, and of course the fundamentals like evictions and foreclosures. And when that reality sets in, no matter who ends up in the White House on January 21st, what will the market do? My concern is that we are headed for a depression. Over at Shadowproof, Kevin Gostola is reporting on a new report coming from the National Whistleblower Center. It's called Ticking Time Bomb, How Fossil Fuel Industry Fraud is Setting Us Up for a Financial Implosion, and What Will Whistleblowers Do? And they describe the history of the oil and gas industries, lying, stealing, cheating. And they say that transition risks as we grapple with climate change and physical risks, being the risk of physical damage to property, economic productivity, and household wealth from climate change, could lead to, well, the worst in an industry with a long history of fraud and deception. And yesterday I mentioned that the National Whistleblower Center is holding an online conference this Thursday. You can find the details in the show file for yesterday's podcast at peterbcollins.com. And speaking of climate crisis, The Guardian has a series underway, and in today's installment, they explain how new research shows that black and brown neighborhoods will be hit hardest by global heating. Killer heat is already affecting communities unequally. U.S. counties with more than 25% black residents have endured an average of 18 days with temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to 7 days a year for counties with fewer than 25% African Americans. So you get the idea. The injustice of climate change will be felt in minority communities. And finally today, remember Peter Strzok, S-T-R-Z-O-K, top FBI counterintelligence agent, ran the Hillary investigation, ran the Trump Russia investigation got bounced from the FBI once Trump took over. Well, he's got a book coming out, Compromised, Counterintelligence and the Threat of Donald J. Trump. And I was going to be generous about it, saying, let's wait and see. Maybe he's going to explain some of the dirty tricks that the FBI was involved with related to Russiagate. But in a teaser promo for the book, Strzok said in a statement, Russia has long regarded the U.S. as its main enemy. I spent decades trying to protect our country from their efforts to weaken and undermine us. In this book, I used that background to explain how the elevation of Trump and his collaborators put their own personal interests over the interests of the country, allowed Putin to succeed beyond Stalin's wildest dreams, and how the national security implications of Putin's triumph will persist through our next election and beyond. Sorry. My generosity has evaporated. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.